126,000 men. That is the official Soviet death toll from the Winter War. The Finns lost 25,000. The Red Army outnumbered them 4-1. They had more tanks than Finland had soldiers. They had an air force. They had artillery. They had the largest military apparatus on the face of the earth in 1939. And in 105 days of war, they were humiliated by a nation of farmers and lumberjacks that the world expected to last 2 weeks. The question is not how Finland survived. The question is how the Soviet Union, with every conceivable advantage in men, machines, and material, managed to die in the snow at the hands of an army it had already dismissed as irrelevant. The answer begins not on the battlefield. It begins in a conference room in Moscow. It begins with a sentence that a Soviet general reportedly said out loud on the record in front of witnesses when asked what he thought of Finnish resistance. They are just farmers. He was not wrong. Most of them were farmers, hunters, loggers, men who had grown up in forests so cold they froze at night in November, men who knew how to move silently through snow, men who could navigate by stars and landmarks through a terrain that offered no roads, no landmarks, and no mercy, men who had been shooting rifles since childhood and could hold a position in -40 degrees because they had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this without ever knowing it was preparation. The Soviet Union made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed that the qualities required to kill men in a frozen forest were the same qualities required to build tanks and train divisions and win parade ground inspections. They were not. And 126,000 Soviet soldiers paid for that assumption with their lives. The border between Finland and the Soviet Union in November 1939 ran for 1,340 kilometers, from the Gulf of Finland in the south to the Arctic Ocean in the north. Along most of that border, the terrain was a military planner's nightmare. Dense pine and birch forest, frozen lakes, bogs that were impassable in summer and barely passable in winter. No major roads, no rail lines west of the Soviet border. Nothing that could support the movement of mechanized forces except for a handful of narrow tracks that wound through the trees. Joseph Stalin knew this terrain. He had studied the maps. His generals had studied the maps. His intelligence services had reported on Finnish defensive positions, Finnish military strength, Finnish reserves. The reports were consistent. Finland was a small nation of 3.7 million people. Its standing army numbered approximately 33,000. Its reserves, when fully mobilized, could produce perhaps 300,000 men. It had no tank force to speak of, no serious air force. Its artillery was old. Its ammunition stocks were estimated to be sufficient for weeks of combat, not months. Stalin was not a foolish man. He did not underestimate the terrain. He underestimated the people inside it. The decision to attack Finland was not impulsive. It had been building for months. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, had given the Soviet Union a free hand in Finland under the secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe between Germany and the USSR. Stalin wanted buffer zones. The Finnish border was 32 kilometers from Leningrad, 32 kilometers from the second city of the Soviet Union. In Stalin's mind, that was an invitation to a knife at his throat. Negotiations began in October 1939. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov presented the Finnish delegation with demands. The Soviets wanted to lease the Hanko Peninsula at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland for a naval base. They wanted territory on the Karelian Isthmus to push the border further from Leningrad. They wanted the island of Sausari in the Gulf of Finland. In exchange, they offered Finland a larger stretch of Soviet Karelia further north, territory that was wilderness, territory that was worth nothing, territory they were offering because they expected Finland to accept. Finland did not accept. The Finnish delegation, led by Juho Kusti Paasikivi, understood what the demands meant. Leasing Hanko meant Soviet troops stationed 60 miles from Helsinki. Ceding Karelian territory meant abandoning the Mannerheim line, the only serious defensive fortification standing between Soviet forces and the Finnish heartland. Accepting these terms did not mean security. It meant a slower invasion. The Finns refused. Negotiations collapsed. And on November 30th, 1939, the Red Army crossed the border. The Soviet plan was simple. It was also the product of an institution that had spent the past 2 years destroying itself. In 1937 and 1938, Stalin had conducted a purge of the Red Army's officer corps that was staggering in its scale and its consequences. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the most innovative military thinker in the Soviet system and the architect of deep battle doctrine, was arrested and shot in June 1937. In the following 18 months, approximately 35,000 Red Army officers were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Among them were 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and 154 of 186 divisional commanders. The Red Army did not just lose experienced officers, it lost the institutional knowledge, the professional culture, and the willingness to question orders that are the difference between an army that thinks and an army that follows. What remained was an officer corps terrified of initiative, men who had watched their superiors shot for perceived disloyalty, men who understood that the safest course of action was always to follow the plan, follow the orders, and never deviate, regardless of what the ground was telling them. The plan for Finland was built on this damaged foundation. The Leningrad military district, commanded by General Kirill Meretskov, had drawn up an operational concept that assumed Finnish resistance would collapse within 9 to 15 days. The calculation was straightforward. Soviet forces would attack on multiple axes simultaneously. The Karelian army would drive along the isthmus toward Viipuri. Secondary forces would attack through the forests of central Finland, severing the country horizontally and preventing any coordinated defense. Northern forces would advance across the Arctic toward the Norwegian border, cutting Finland off from potential Allied resupply. The Finnish government, facing simultaneous attacks along a 1,340-kilometer front, would negotiate or collapse. The plan accounted for Finnish military dispositions. It accounted for the weather to a degree. It did not account for what Finnish soldiers would do in a forest at night when the temperature dropped below -30 and the Soviet supply lines stretched back across a border that was already 40 kilometers behind. 4 Soviet armies crossed into Finland on November 30th. The 7th Army attacked on the Karelian Isthmus, driving toward the Mannerheim line with 12 divisions. The 8th Army attacked north of Lake Ladoga with 6 divisions. The 9th Army attacked through the wilderness of central Finland. The 14th Army attacked in the far north. In total, the initial assault force numbered approximately 450,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. Finland mobilized. Every man who could carry a rifle was called up. The total Finnish force, regulars and reserves combined, numbered approximately 300,000. They had no tanks of consequence, 130 aircraft, many of them obsolete, artillery that was adequate but not modern, and a country so invested in its independence that the idea of surrender had no cultural vocabulary. Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim assumed command of the Finnish defense forces. Mannerheim was 72 years old. He had commanded Finnish forces during the 1918 Civil War. He had served in the Imperial Russian Army for decades before that, reaching the rank of lieutenant general. He understood the terrain of Karelia as well as any man alive, and he understood something about the Soviet military that Kirill Meretskov apparently did not. The Red Army was powerful. It was not nimble. It could not improvise. And in the forests of Finland, improvisation was the only doctrine that worked. The Mannerheim Line was not what Soviet propaganda later described it as. Soviet communiques and subsequent Soviet historical accounts portrayed it as an impregnable fortress system of reinforced concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, tank obstacles, and minefields stretching the full width of the Karelian Isthmus. This served a useful purpose. It explained why the Red Army had struggled. If the defenses were that formidable, the struggle was understandable. The Mannerheim Line was not that formidable. A Finnish military assessment conducted after the war found that the line consisted of 101 permanent concrete bunkers of varying quality, most of them built in the 1920s and not upgraded. Some were reinforced, some were not. The bunkers covered roughly 135 kilometers of the 45-kilometer wide isthmus, but with significant gaps. There were no prepared anti-tank obstacles along most of the line. There were minefields, but they were not comprehensive. A force with the firepower and engineering capacity of the Red Army should have been through the Mannerheim Line in days. Instead, it took 3 months. The reason was not the concrete. The reason was the men behind it. Finnish soldiers on the Karelian Isthmus fought from positions they had in many cases helped build or had trained on for years. They knew every fold of the ground, every frozen stream, every tree line. They understood that defending a bunker meant more than sitting inside it. It meant sending small patrols into the forest at night to hit Soviet supply columns. It meant counterattacking immediately when any position was taken, before Soviet forces could consolidate. It meant maintaining communications and unit cohesion under artillery fire that went on for days without pause. Soviet infantry attacking across open frozen ground toward Finnish positions faced something they had not been trained to deal with. Not just fire from the front, fire from the flanks, fire from behind. Finnish soldiers who had let them pass and then materialized from the forest to cut them off. Men who could move through snow in silence and appear where they were not supposed to be. By the end of the first week of December, the 7th Army's assault on the Mannerheim Line had stalled. Soviet divisions had advanced 3 to 5 kilometers into Finnish territory on the isthmus and stopped. They were not stopped by bunkers. They were stopped by a defense so flexible and so ferocious that the Soviet commanders, trained in an institution that had killed its best thinkers, could not adapt to it. The situation north of Lake Ladoga was worse. North of Lake Ladoga, the Red Army entered a landscape that was not a battlefield in any sense the Soviet military had prepared for. The forests there were not the managed woodlands of Western Europe. They were boreal wilderness, ancient pine trees growing so close together that visibility in places was less than 20 meters. Frozen lakes that could support infantry but not tanks until the ice thickened further into winter. Trails that existed only as gaps in the trees, most of them known only to locals. No roads capable of supporting heavy vehicles. Nothing that resembled the terrain that Soviet mechanized doctrine had been designed for. The 8th Army's 3 lead divisions crossed the Finnish border north of Ladoga in late November and began moving west. They were following the only routes available, the roads and tracks through the forest. Division after division, column after column, vehicles and horse-drawn artillery and infantry on foot, all moving in the same narrow corridors because there was nowhere else to go. The Finns understood this immediately. They did not try to stop the Soviet columns at the border. They let them come. They let them advance. They let the columns stretch and thin and extend and move far from their supply bases. Then they struck. The Finnish tactic was called moti. The word in Finnish means a cubic meter of firewood, the standard unit used when logging. The moti tactic was conceptually simple. Finnish ski troops would move through the forest parallel to the Soviet columns, faster than the columns could march because the Finns moved on skis and knew the terrain. They would identify the thinnest points of the column, the gaps between units, the stretches where the forest closed in tight on both sides. Then they would cut through the column simultaneously at multiple points, severing it into isolated sections. Each section, each motta, was now cut off from supply and from reinforcement. The Finns did not immediately assault these pockets. They surrounded them. They kept them under fire. They shot men who came out to gather firewood. They shot men who came out to fetch water from streams. They waited. A Soviet column that enters a Finnish forest in December and gets cut off from its supply lines faces a specific arithmetic of death. The temperature at night is -25 to -40 degrees. A man cannot survive that temperature without shelter, fire, and food. Soviet soldiers in the forests of central Finland had tents and some equipment, but they had been advancing on a timetable that assumed the campaign would be over before the deep cold settled in. Many did not have adequate winter clothing. Some units had been issued summer boots. The first major moti encirclement happened to elements of the Soviet 139th and 75th Divisions north of Ladoga in early December. Finnish ski troops under Colonel Paavo Talvela cut the Soviet columns and began the process of isolation. The Soviet units attempted breakout. The breakouts were ambushed. They attempted to establish supply drops by air. The aircraft were insufficient, the weather was brutal, and the drops fell in the wrong places. Men began to freeze. By mid-December, the Soviet forces north of Ladoga were in crisis. Entire regiments were encircled. Division commanders were reporting that their men were dying not from Finnish bullets, but from cold. Soviet dead were found frozen in sitting positions, in the positions they had occupied when the temperature dropped and they could no longer move. Some were found in circles around dead fires, having exhausted every piece of wood within reach. General Kirill Meretskov reported to Moscow that the campaign was not proceeding as planned. This was an understatement of historic proportion. Suomussalmi is a name that appears in military history textbooks as an example of catastrophic defeat. It is a small town in central Finland, roughly 800 kilometers north of Helsinki, surrounded by forests and frozen lakes. In December 1939, it was the site of the most complete destruction of a modern military force in the opening phase of any war in the 20th century. The Soviet 44th Division and the Soviet 163rd Division were tasked with capturing Suomussalmi and then driving west to the Gulf of Bothnia, cutting Finland in two. The plan was strategically bold. The terrain was catastrophic for the forces assigned to execute it. The 163rd Division crossed into Finland on November 30th and began moving towards Suomussalmi along a single road through the forest. The division numbered approximately 14,000 men with artillery, support elements, and transport vehicles. They moved slowly. The road was poor. The forest pressed in on both sides. There was nowhere to deploy off the road. The columns stretched for kilometers. Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo had approximately 11,000 men, not all of them trained soldiers. Some were civic guard volunteers. Some were reservists who had been in uniform for days. They had insufficient artillery and limited ammunition. What they had was the forest, the cold, and an understanding of the terrain that their enemy entirely lacked. Silasvuo did not attempt to stop the 163rd Division head-on. He let them reach Suomussalmi. He let them occupy the town. Then he cut them off. Finnish ski troops moved through the forest on both flanks of the Soviet column. They severed the road behind the 163rd at multiple points simultaneously. The 14,000-man division was now isolated inside a Finnish town with the forest closing around them and no supply line. The temperature dropped. The 163rd Division began to die. The Soviet High Command responded by sending the 44th Division to relieve the 163rd. The 44th was a better equipped, better trained unit from Ukraine. It moved up the same road from the east, strung out in a column over 40 kilometers with tanks, artillery, horses, and infantry all competing for the same narrow track through the forest. Silasvuo did not wait for the 44th to reach Suomussalmi. He left a holding force around the trapped 163rd, turned east with his main strength, and hit the 44th Division on the road. The battle that followed lasted from late December 1939 into early January 1940. The 44th Division, strung out along 40 kilometers of forest road, was attacked at multiple points simultaneously by Finnish ski troops, who materialized from the trees, fired, and disappeared. The Soviets could not bring their numerical advantage to bear. They could not deploy off the road. Their tanks were useless in the dense forest. Their artillery could not depress far enough to engage targets in the trees on either side. Their radios worked poorly in the cold. By January 8th, the 44th Division had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. An estimated 17,000 Soviet soldiers of the two divisions had been killed. Thousands more had been captured. Finnish forces captured 43 tanks, 270 trucks, 300 horses, dozens of artillery pieces, and enough weapons and ammunition to re-equip several Finnish regiments. The 163rd Division, the unit that had been trapped in Suomussalmi since December, attempted a breakout when it became clear the 44th was destroyed. Most of those men died in the snow. The division lost approximately 8,000 killed. Finnish losses at Suomussalmi: 750 men killed, 1,300 wounded. Divisional commander of the 44th, Alexei Vinogradov, was court-martialed and shot in front of his surviving troops by order of the commander of the 9th Army. This was the Soviet answer to failure, not analysis, not adaptation, a bullet. By January 1940, the scale of Soviet failure was undeniable, even in Moscow. The Red Army had attacked with 4 armies along 1,340 kilometers of front. After 6 weeks of combat, it had achieved almost nothing. The Mannerheim line held. The forests of central Finland were full of Soviet dead and surrounded Soviet pockets. Entire divisions had been destroyed. Logistics had broken down across multiple sectors. The world was watching a superpower unable to defeat a nation of farmers in 3 weeks, in 6 weeks, in 2 months. Stalin did what Stalin did when a system failed. He removed the people running it and replaced them with someone he trusted to produce results regardless of cost. General Semyon Timoshenko was appointed commander of the Northwestern Front on January 7, 1940. Timoshenko was a survivor of the purges. He was loyal, competent, methodical, and utterly unsentimental about the cost in human lives that success would require. He inherited a catastrophe and set about rebuilding it. Timoshenko's approach was not subtle. He did not attempt to replicate the Mottar tactics or match the Finns' skill in forest warfare. He did not try to outmaneuver the Finnish defenses. He massed forces on the Karelian Isthmus and prepared a frontal assault so overwhelming in its concentration of firepower that the Mannerheim line would be physically broken regardless of the men defending it. Over January and early February, Timoshenko rebuilt the Soviet assault force on the isthmus. He brought in fresh divisions. He reorganized the artillery arm, concentrating heavy guns at densities that the Mannerheim line had never been designed to withstand. He brought up engineers to clear obstacles and build routes through the Finnish defenses. He established a proper supply system. He trained his infantry in new assault tactics designed to follow artillery fire closely and exploit the holes it created. On February 1, 1940, Timoshenko began a preparatory bombardment of the Mannerheim line. Finnish artillery observers watching from forward positions reported what they saw: shells arriving at a rate of 300,000 per day, the ground shaking continuously, concrete bunkers cracking under the weight of fire that went on for days without pause. Finnish soldiers in their positions, many of them farmers who had been in uniform for less than 2 months, absorbing this bombardment and remaining at their posts because they had nowhere else to go. On February 11th, the main assault began. 21 Soviet divisions attacked on a narrow front. The weight of artillery support was greater than anything seen on the Eastern Front until the major battles of 1943. Finnish positions were destroyed. Gaps were torn in the line. Soviet infantry moved through those gaps in waves, advancing behind a creeping barrage that moved at the pace of walking men. The Mannerheim line began to crack. The Finnish command had known since early February that the Mannerheim line could not hold indefinitely against the weight Timoshenko was applying. The question was not whether it would break, but when, and what could be salvaged when it did. Field Marshal Mannerheim had been managing a defense on the edge of collapse since December. His reserves were exhausted. His men had been fighting for 10 weeks without rotation. The armies of central Finland that had performed the Motti operations were being ground down not by defeat, but by continuous engagement with a force that had enough men to lose a regiment every day and replace it with another. The Finnish government began the process that Finnish military planners had always understood might be necessary, seeking terms. Sweden had allowed some volunteer recruitment. Britain and France had promised material support and were discussing the possibility of an expeditionary force. But the Allied support was slow to arrive, uncertain in its scope, and complicated by Norway and Sweden's refusal to allow transit of Allied troops. Finland was alone. Finland had always been alone. On February 15th, the Soviet breakthrough on the isthmus forced a Finnish withdrawal from the first line of the Mannerheim defenses to the second line, and then rapidly to the third. The defensive depth was running out. Soviet forces were now approaching Viipuri, the second largest city in Finland. The fall of Viipuri would open the road to Helsinki. Finnish President Risto Ryti and Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner began negotiations. The Soviets, under Molotov, presented their terms. The terms were harder now than they had been in October. The Hanko lease, the Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri, the western shore of Lake Ladoga, territory that represented 11% of Finland's land area and 30% of its economic value, territory that had been Finnish for generations, territory where 430,000 Finns lived. The Finnish cabinet debated. The military situation was desperate. The Western Allies had finally committed to sending an expeditionary force, but it would not arrive before Viipuri fell. Mannerheim was clear in his assessment. He could not hold much longer. Resistance was continuing to cost Finnish lives at an unsustainable rate. The army was still fighting. It had not broken, but it was near its limit. On March 6th, a Finnish delegation arrived in Moscow to sign. On March 13, 1940, at 11 a.m., the Moscow Peace Treaty came into force. The Winter War was over. The terms Finland accepted were brutal. The Karelian Isthmus, with its industrial city of Viipuri and the entire defensive infrastructure of the Mannerheim line, passed to the Soviet Union. The western shore of Lake Ladoga was ceded. The Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Soviets for 30 years as a naval base. Finland lost approximately 11% of its territory and 30% of its economic capacity. 430,000 Finnish Karelians were evacuated in a matter of days. They left with what they could carry. They left their farms, their homes, their churches, their ancestors' graves. The photographs of the Karelian evacuation show ordinary people on roads in March snow, pulling carts and carrying bundles, not soldiers, civilians, the cost of a war they had not started. Finnish military losses in 105 days of combat: 25,904 killed and missing, 43,557 wounded. Soviet losses are still disputed. The official Soviet figures, released in 1991 after the collapse of the USSR, acknowledged 126,875 killed and 264,908 wounded. Subsequent Russian and Finnish research suggests the true figure may be higher. Some estimates accounting for soldiers listed as missing, frozen to death, or who died of wounds after the armistice reach between 160,000 and 170,000 dead. For every Finn killed, the Red Army lost at minimum 5 of its own men. The world noticed. They noticed not just the casualties, but the pattern. The Red Army had fought for 105 days to defeat a nation it expected to conquer in 15. It had achieved its territorial objectives, but at a cost that revealed the full extent of the damage the purges had done. The German military attachés who observed the Winter War filed reports to Berlin that influenced Hitler's planning for Operation Barbarossa. The Red Army, they concluded, was a hollow institution, large but brittle, capable of mass but not of improvisation, an army that could absorb enormous punishment but could not think under pressure. That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong in 1941 and 1942, and the years that followed. But in March 1940, looking at the graves of 126,000 men, it was difficult to argue with. What the Winter War established in Finnish national memory is not what it established in Soviet or German military assessments. For Finland, the 105 days of the Winter War produced a national identity of singular clarity. A small nation, outnumbered, without allies, without tanks, without the industrial capacity of its opponent, had held a superpower for more than 3 months and forced it to negotiate rather than simply conquer. The soldiers who did this were not professional warriors. They were farmers, lumberjacks, factory workers, teachers, university students, men who had been called up and given rifles and told to go into the forest and defend Finland. They had done it with a skill and a tenacity that professional military analysts struggled to quantify because it did not fit existing models of military effectiveness. What they had was knowledge. They knew the land, they knew the cold, they knew how to move through snow and how to remain still in snow and how to wait in snow for an enemy who was tired and cold and lost. They knew that the forest was not an obstacle to movement, it was cover. They knew that a road through the forest was not a route, it was a trap. Every Soviet soldier who died in a Motti encirclement died because a Finnish farmer had understood something about his own land that no Soviet military intelligence report had captured. They are just farmers. That was the assessment. That was the mistake. The farmers buried 126,000 of the men who said it. Finland survived the Winter War. It survived the continuation war that followed from 1941 to 1944. It survived the Cold War as the only democratic nation bordering the Soviet Union that maintained its independence throughout. It joined NATO in April 2023, 84 years after the Soviet Union crossed its border to end its sovereignty. The bid succeeded on the first ballot. The vote was unanimous. The farmers are still there. They remember everything. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And watch this next video. You are not going to believe what this man did.